You're in the dairy aisle of the grocery store. You pick up a package of cheese, flip it over, read the ingredient list, and think you know what you're buying. But let me tell you something the food industry isn't going to tell you. The label you're reading was designed to look transparent without actually being transparent. And the 3 brands I'm going to show you today are proof of that. Stay until the end, because beyond exposing what's wrong, I'm going to give you 4 options that are actually worth your money. When you flip a cheese package over and read the ingredient list, it feels like you're getting complete information. Milk, live lactobacillus cultures, and salt. It seems simple. It seems honest. The problem is that the FDA, the federal agency that regulates food, allows certain additives to be grouped under generic terms. Words like condiments, enzymes, or anti-caking agents that can conceal individual compounds without the consumer knowing exactly what they're ingesting. If an ingredient appears below a certain percentage of the final product, it can be omitted or folded into an umbrella term that tells you nothing concrete. This isn't outright illegal. It's a regulatory loophole that the food industry knows far better than the average consumer and uses consistently. The practical consequence is that you may be buying something that contains up to half a dozen additional compounds that never clearly appear on the nutrition panel. And when those compounds accumulate, coming not from a single product, but from dozens of processed foods you're consuming in parallel over days, weeks, and months, the picture changes entirely. Before we talk about specific brands, I need you to understand one ingredient that's going to come up several times in this conversation, because it's the best example of how the industry operates in this gray zone: cellulose. Cellulose is fiber. You've probably heard that before, and in the context of fresh vegetables, it makes complete sense. But the cellulose that shows up in industrially shredded cheeses doesn't come from vegetables. It comes from processed wood pulp. The refining process makes it chemically identical to plant-based cellulose, which is why the FDA classifies it as a food additive that is generally recognized as safe, the well-known GRAS designation. The problem here isn't necessarily acute toxicity. The problem is what it represents inside the package. The declared function of cellulose in these products is to prevent shredded cheese from clumping. It coats the particles and keeps them from sticking together, but it fulfills that function while also replacing a portion of the actual cheese. Independent analyses published over the years, including investigative reports from Bloomberg and the Chicago Tribune, which sent shredded Parmesan cheeses to labs for testing, found samples with cellulose levels reaching 8 and 9% of the total product. You're buying cheese and receiving a significant fraction of what you paid for in processed wood fiber. That's within what the FDA permits. But it wasn't part of the deal you made with the brand when you put that package in your cart. Now let's talk about specific brands, because generalization doesn't protect anyone. The first brand is Kraft Singles, probably the most recognizable dairy product in the United States. It's been in lunchboxes for decades. It's the yellow slice that goes in the sandwiches of millions of Americans every single day. And that's exactly why it's worth starting here, because the story this product tells about itself is very different from what the FDA says it actually is. The FDA does not allow Kraft Singles to be called cheese. The required label is pasteurized processed cheese product, and that distinction exists for a precise technical and regulatory reason. To be legally called cheese, a product must contain at least 51% real cheese in its composition. Kraft Singles does not meet that threshold. What fills the rest is processing ingredients, and the list of them is telling. Sodium phosphate appears as an emulsifier. It gives the product that texture that melts uniformly. Propylene glycol alginate, a derivative of alginic acid, is used to stabilize consistency. Artificial coloring rounds out the visual appearance. And here's where the public health concern extends beyond a single slice. High and frequent consumption of added phosphates is associated, in studies published in the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, with negative effects on kidney function and phosphorus metabolism, particularly in populations with a predisposition to cardiovascular or renal disease. This isn't speculation. This is peer-reviewed scientific literature. The point isn't that one Kraft Single is going to destroy your health. The point is that you're buying something that the federal regulatory agency itself refuses to classify as cheese, and paying cheese prices for it. The second brand is Sargento, which positions itself differently in the market. The brand's messaging bets on familiarity, quality, and American tradition. Compared to heavily processed products, some Sargento lines have cleaner ingredient lists, and that's true. But the brand's seasoned cheese and blend lines consistently include one ingredient that deserves far more attention than it gets: natamycin. Natamycin is an antifungal. The FDA approves its use on the surface of natural cheeses as a preservative. It inhibits the growth of molds and fungi without affecting bacteria, which technically makes it compatible with the aging process. The agency classifies its use within established limits as safe. So far, everything is within regulatory bounds. What most consumers don't know is that natamycin is also an active antifungal medication used in pharmaceutical formulations to treat fungal eye infections, approved by the FDA for clinical use under the brand name Naticin. The substance you find on the edge of a Sargento sliced cheese is the same molecule used in medical treatments. That doesn't mean the concentration in cheese is equivalent to a clinical dose. Clearly, it isn't. But it raises a question that science has not yet answered satisfactorily. What are the effects of chronic exposure to small daily doses of an antifungal agent on the human gut microbiome? The microbiome depends on a delicate balance between fungal and bacterial populations. Studies on the effects of antifungals on the gut microbiome, such as those published in the journals Cell Host and Microbe, show that exposure to antifungals alters the fungal composition of the gut in ways that may have consequences for immune health. Science does not claim that natamycin in cheese is dangerous at the concentrations present. What it does say is that this specific question has not been studied in enough depth for us to say it is entirely without effect. And that uncertainty in a product consumed daily should not be brushed aside. The third is Great Value, Walmart's store brand. In the cheese segment, it offers prices that are genuinely difficult to explain through simple economies of scale alone. Shredded Parmesan, sliced cheddar, mozzarella, all consistently priced below the market. And the question any food analyst asks when they see that kind of pricing is straightforward. What is being substituted to reach that number? In the case of Great Value shredded cheeses, the answer includes cellulose at elevated proportions, modified cornstarch as a texturing agent, and, in some product variations, partially hydrogenated cottonseed oil. That last item requires special attention. Partially hydrogenated oils are the primary source of artificial trans fats, the same category of fats the FDA declared not safe for human consumption and banned from deliberate addition to foods in 2018, with a compliance deadline that expired in 2020 for most products. The key point here is that the ban applies to use as an intentionally added ingredient. Some specific formulations continue to exist under different technical designations, or in products whose approval processes predate the deadline. When you see partially hydrogenated oil on any ingredient list today, it's worth asking how that specific product is still on shelves, and whether that question has an answer you'd feel comfortable accepting. The lesson from Great Value isn't that Walmart is the villain of the story. It's that the lowest price in a commodity food market almost always means someone is paying the difference, and that someone, most of the time, is the person eating the product. There's a term that circulates inside processed food companies that you've probably never heard outside that context: texture management. It's the technical corporate name for the process of adding compounds that make a cheaper product behave, in your mouth and to your eyes, like a higher quality one. Carrageenan, extracted from seaweed, thickens and creates a sensation of creaminess. Xanthan gum and modified guar gum adjust viscosity. Phosphates control how the product melts. Each of these compounds has, in isolation, a legitimate technological function and a regulatory safety classification. The problem isn't any single one of them. The problem is the consumption pattern that forms when you eat products with 2 or 3 of these additives at breakfast, 3 more at lunch, 2 more in the afternoon, day after day, week after week. The exposure isn't from one isolated product. It's the sum of everything. Studies on carrageenan, for example, including reviews published in the journal Environmental Health Perspectives, have raised questions about possible inflammatory effects in the gastrointestinal tract, especially in animal models. The FDA maintains the GRAS classification, but independent researchers continue to question whether the available data is sufficient to cover modern consumption patterns, where this ingredient appears in dozens of products simultaneously. This is not an area where scientific consensus is settled, and that alone should be relevant information for any consumer. Now, the other side of the story. Because this channel exists to give you actionable information, not to leave you frozen in front of the grocery store refrigerator with no idea what to do. There are brands that have made different choices, with ingredient lists you can verify, compare, and trust. Organic Valley is perhaps the cleanest example. The ingredient list on their cheeses does exactly what a cheese ingredient list should do. Organic milk, bacterial culture, salt, enzyme. 4 items. No added antifungals, no cellulose, no phosphates. The cooperative operates within the USDA's organic certification standards, which impose restrictions on the use of antibiotics, synthetic hormones, and a range of additives that appear routinely in conventional brands. Cabot Creamery, a cooperative based in Vermont, maintains production standards that exclude most of the problematic additives and carries B Corp certification, which creates a public and verifiable accountability for its production practices. This isn't just marketing. B Corp certification requires periodic impact assessments covering social and environmental criteria, which creates a level of accountability that conventional brands simply don't have. Their cheddar is produced with milk from cooperative farmers across New England, and the ingredient list reflects that. Tillamook, from Oregon, uses milk free of synthetic growth hormones, RBST, and consistently maintains a clean ingredient list across its entire product line. Their cheddar has fewer ingredients than most granola bars you'll find on the market. That simplicity isn't an accident. It's a product decision the company makes a point of communicating, and one you can verify by flipping over any package. Kerrygold, the Irish brand widely available in the United States, operates under European dairy regulations, which are systematically more restrictive than American ones when it comes to the use of hormones, antibiotics, and additives. The milk comes from cows raised predominantly on pasture, which affects the nutritional profile of the fat, with more favorable ratios of omega-3 fatty acids and conjugated linoleic acid, as documented in comparative studies such as those published in the Journal of Dairy Science. The composition of Kerrygold cheeses reflects the absence of the most common additives found in the American market. 4 brands. Verifiable ingredient lists. No mystery. Let me give you a practical rule you can apply right now, the next time you're standing in the dairy aisle. No app needed, no reference list required. A real cheese has between 3 and 5 ingredients: milk or pasteurized milk, bacterial culture, salt, rennet, or enzyme. Sometimes calcium chloride for coagulation process control. That's cheese. If the list has more than 6 items, each additional ingredient represents a question worth asking. Is this ingredient here to serve you? To preserve quality, maintain flavor, ensure microbiological safety? Or is it here to serve the company's logistics, to extend shelf life beyond what's natural, to compensate for lower quality raw materials, to make a cheaper product behave like a more expensive one? The answer isn't always simple, but the question is always worth asking. Cellulose, phosphates, synthetic antifungals, and partially hydrogenated oils didn't end up in those packages by accident. They got there because each one of them solved a problem the company had. A problem of cost, scale, shelf life, or texture. The consumer who knows this isn't paranoid. They're simply harder to fool. This series continues. In upcoming episodes, we'll walk through other aisles: sodas, sauces, breakfast cereals, processed meats. Because the labeling loophole we saw today in the cheese aisle isn't unique to the dairy industry. It's the operating model for a large portion of the American food market. And the more you know, the less they can count on your ignorance. If this content opened your eyes today, share it with someone who should also know. And drop a comment. Which brand were you consuming without knowing what was really inside? I read every single one.